Welcome back to the TLDR News Podcast. I'm Jack Kelly, and this week I'm joined by Zach Michaelis.
Hello.
And Ben Blissett.
Hello.
How you both doing?
Good.
Yeah, very well.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
It's been a little while since three of us been together.
Yeah, how's you been? You've been away.
I've been away. Rory's now ill, so he's not here.
He is.
Yeah.
We'll have everyone back together one day.
Yeah,
it's been a while, but we'll be back. We'll be back.
We survived anyway.
We did.
Yeah.
Someone who might not be back, Suella Braverman, is
What about your segue? Jesus Christ.
absolute handbrake turn. Sorry. Suella Braverman, though.
Yeah.
She's our main story today. When we're discussing the latest news out of Westminster. We're also going to be talking about some underreported stories, as always, brought to you by Ben and Zach. And at the end, we'll be doing the World Leader Leaderboard.
Okay.
So let's get into it. Let's start with underreported stories. And Ben, let's start with yours.
Yeah, so a video that went out on the UK channel either this week or last week was to do with the Renters Reform Bill and the changes that it's going to be that it's making to renting. One of the sort of side effects from this, though, that's been reported this week is the massive increase in the use of Section 21 notices. So Section 21 notices are it gives the landlord the power to evict tenants without faults. It's no fault evictions. The Renters Reform Bill aims to ban them. There has been some speculation that there will be loopholes in the bill to allow landlords to use no-fault evictions, but landlords are getting wary that they're not going to be able to use these soon. So ahead of the bill being made law, landlords are seemingly kicking out tenants. So this year, Section 21 notices, the use of them has increased by 38%, and it's at a 7-year high, the use of them. So I think the government is obviously trying to stop people being kicked out, but an unintended side effect of the bill being introduced is the fact that landlords are trying to use these seemingly before they feel that they're not able to, and this is obviously, it's bad for people that are renting. It's the security that people feel with renting. That's obviously one of the big issues, and one of the issues that the bill is nominally trying to solve. And one of the side effects, unfortunately, has actually been to increase the use of these for them being banned. I know over the long term it should hopefully make things better, but at least in the short term, it's certainly not good news.
Zach, what's your underreported story?
My underreported story, I mean, it's a bit cheap of me to call it underreported because I did report on it, but I still think it is underreported, and I still just really think it's very interesting, is the tensions in Ethiopia, between Ethiopia and its Red Sea neighbours. So that's sort of like Somalia, Djibouti, and Eritrea. And I think it's an interesting story for a whole load of reasons. I mean, obviously, there's the prospect of a war. So Ethiopia's been threatening those countries because it wants permanent access to one of their ports on the Red Sea. And the Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, has been talking about how that's their historic right and all that sort of shenanigans.
Sure.
But the other reason I think it's a really interesting story is because it's about, in some part, this entire story is a sort of function of the diplomatic revival of places like Eritrea. So Eritrea was a complete pariah state for a while, which made it very diplomatically reliant on its neighbours. But, and again, this is a story about this wider realignment. It's with sort of countries like China, Iran, Russia, North Korea to a lesser extent, developing ties with Eritrea. Eritrea just all of a sudden has this room for manoeuvre. And it's a symptom of the fact that when you have this sort of like, I think sometimes unfairly described as an axis of evil, these sort of like slightly chaotic group of countries providing diplomatic support to other more minor autocratic regimes, it does create this instability, and it does sort of encourage them into, like kicking off a little bit. And so, yeah, in some part, the Ethiopia-Eritrea tensions are part of this like wider global shift that has emboldened slightly more autocratic regimes. But yeah, so that's my report story.
And where can you watch the video about that?
TLDR Global.
There we go. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you both. Both interesting stories, both illuminating and enlightening. Let's get into the main story, though. The latest updates about Suella Braverman in the UK. Ben, do you want to give us a quick rundown of what's been happening and what the latest updates are?
Yes, there's been a bit of speculation for a few weeks now that Suella Braverman is basically trying to get herself fired from the cabinet as Home Secretary. She's sometimes acted with disloyalty, I think it's fair to say, towards the Prime Minister. But it seems that her actions today might be the thing that pushes Sunak over the edge and does make him decide to fire it. In fact, obviously at the time of recording, she is still the Home Secretary. I think it's probably important to point that out. But basically, she's written an article for The Times, which has been published today, and it's all about the protests that are going to be taking place on Saturday for Gaza, so the pro-Palestine marches. Obviously, Saturday is Remembrance Day.
Yes.
And there is concern among the right, I think it's fair to say, or among the government, specifically the government as well, about the potential for the pro-Palestine marches to disrupt remembrance on Saturday. And this has been sort of a bit of a national debate recently. Braverman wrote the article basically describing pro-Palestine marches as hate marches, and she compared them to sectarian rallies in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. She's also had a pop at the Metropolitan Police, accusing them of double standards and saying that they take a soft approach to left-wing marches like Black Lives Matter, rather than how they act to like football hooliganism and anti-lockdown marches. Basically, this is her criticism towards the Met has been because the Met has come out and said that this Saturday, the marches for Palestine on Remembrance Day doesn't meet the threshold for serious disorder that would give the police the ability to ban that protest.
Okay.
So they're allowing the pro-Palestine march to go ahead. So Braverman has effectively criticised the police, criticised an operational decision of the police, which is to do with allowing the march to go ahead on Saturday, and described just painted with a broad brush pro-Palestine marches, hate marches. Now, she did tell the Prime Minister on Wednesday, so at the time of recording yesterday, so Wednesday this week, that she's going to be publishing this article, and sent the article in advance to the Prime Minister. He made edits to it, but she didn't accept them all, and it's now gone out today. Now, the reason that this could lead to her being fired is, well, firstly, she's undermined the operational independence of the police, which is important, and as Home Secretary, she shouldn't be doing.
Sure.
So that is obviously the idea that the police should operate in a distinct manner to the Home Office, two distinct branches. So she's undermined that. And she might have broken the ministerial code on 2 counts. The first one is it was obviously not signed off by the Prime Minister. Any communications, the ministerial code says that all major interviews and media appearances, both print and broadcast, need to be signed off by the press office. Which it wasn't. The second thing is it could break collective cabinet responsibility, and there has been some discussion about whether it does that. The argument that it doesn't break collective cabinet responsibility is basically that it usually just refers to policy. So it's the argument of whether what she's written actually refers to policy, or it was more of a generic sort of statement. Again, it's quite clear she's probably broken the first one, and there's debate about whether she's broken the second one. And usually if you break the ministerial code, you either resign or are sacked. But this actually puts Sunak in quite an awkward position, because he's obviously got 2 options now. Fire her, which would be basically what she wants, and what a lot of people have been suggesting she's been trying to do for the last 2 weeks. The reason being that on the backbenches, obviously the Tories look like they're going to lose the next election.
Sure.
On the backbenches, she can then, when they do lose, say, I wasn't involved in any of that. I was on the backbench. I was criticising them from the back. I should be the next leader. They did terribly.
Sure.
So it positions her quite well to make a leadership challenge, which she probably will do if Sunak loses the next election. So he probably won't want to sack her, but if he leaves her in post, it makes him look incredibly weak. You've got a minister that's been outwardly sort of rebellious against you, possibly broken the ministerial code, possibly undermined the operational independence of the police, and it'll be quite obvious to most people that the only reason he's kept her in the cabinet is because he's worried about her doing a leadership bid or her leadership ambitions. So it's not a great position for him to be in. Both options seem pretty bad. That's basically what's been happening, and the discussion now is what Sunak's going to do, and what the best decision seems to be from his perspective.
Zach, what's your take on both her actions and also the likelihood of Sunak having to step in and do something here?
I mean, it comes to my personal take on Suella Braverman's statement and article. Like Ben, I don't think it's a good thing. I think that there's a reason that the Home Secretary is supposed to basically be consistent in terms of her messaging with the police and not criticise the police, and that's sort of that's a reflection of the constitutional structure of the UK. I think the interesting question here is not about whether or not I think it's like right or wrong. It's more about the politics of it. And I'm slightly divided here because on the one hand, I actually think from Suella Braverman's perspective, it's not bad. If she wants to become leader, it's a pretty good tactic, really, because not only it turns out polling suggests that actually a majority of Brits want the protests to be stopped. There's been polling out, I think, today that says 50% of Brits want it to be stopped and 32% want the protests to go ahead. The remaining 18% don't know. But also the vast, vast majority of the Tory base obviously want the protests to be stopped. And that's the audience that she's trying to play up to. So, from her perspective, I think it's actually a pretty savvy move. I think she's making a good pitch for the leadership. And I think that this, again, it goes back to this wider problem for Sunak, which is that he just can't maintain unity when an election loss is so inevitable.
Yeah.
And you enter this horrible positive feedback loop from his perspective, where the disunity makes your polling worse, which makes the disunity worse, which makes the polling worse. From Sunak's perspective, I think, to be honest, I just think it's sort of irrelevant. Like, he's going to lose either way. The polling is really appalling for the Tories at the moment. Yeah. And the poll actually suggests that even though Starmer hasn't really had a great week, that he's actually increased his lead in the last couple of days or so. So I think from Sunak's point, it doesn't really mean he's going to last until the end of the election, then he's going to be gone. Yeah. I think it's sort of redundant whether or not he fires her. And sure, she has, she has a bit more space to criticise the government if she does end up on the backbenches, but clearly she's criticising them already, so I don't really think it makes much of a difference to her leadership ambitions either if she gets fired. I think that's sort of redundant. I think that you're just going to keep on seeing her criticise the government from the backbenches or from the front benches. But yeah, I think she's making quite an effective ploy for the leadership. The only thing that I think is interesting is this is yet another example of Suella Braverman importing American political talking points, which don't, this one, sure, there's a majority support for, at least according to polling, but actually, that's just not a good political tactic in the UK. We haven't, our police and the issue of policing is not as politicised in the UK as it is in America. And I think you all saw this last week when she put out a series of tweets, or maybe it was also a piece about rough sleeping, where she described homelessness as a lifestyle choice, and said she wanted to come up with new, was it banning tents?
Yeah, banning,
and she explicitly made reference to San Francisco and LA, which is the sort of thing that if you're hyper politicized, if you're a Politico like us and you spend your life on Twitter, you understand those references, you've seen those videos, but your median British voter has no idea what you're talking about when you talk about the San Francisco homelessness situation. But again, I think actually it probably plays quite well with the Tory base, who probably are aware of those sort of Republican talking points, let's say. I don't think it's good, but I understand why she's done it, and I think she's probably making a pretty effective ploy for the leadership.
I sort of agree. And when you were saying that it both situations effectively, seem just as bad for Sunak, I think I tend to agree. I just think that sacking her, because his issue coming into the leadership was that the Tories had been, comes off the back of Boris Johnson, who broke a ton of rules and got ousted because of that, and Liz Truss as well. I think that and he did his whole opening speech about how he's going to bring back accountability and professionalism to the role. And I think that if he is going to be true to that, and again, I agree with you, it's almost certainly that he's going to lose the next election. All of this is kind of redundant at this point. But I think it is just slightly better to sack her and to be able to say, look, she undermined operational independence. She broke the ministerial code. She's gone. I'm being professional and everything. She can run her leadership bid from the backbenches. You can try and do all of that, but ultimately Sunak's going to remain in post until the election, at least, and he's almost certainly going to have to resign or go if he loses the election. I just think of the two options, it seems the more sensible one for him to get rid of her and to sack her. It's not great. We're talking about mildly better, but I do just think that that's the more sensible option at this point.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at here. I think that's true in a sense. I think there's a sort of a risk on the flip side, which is that if he does fire her, he does risk upsetting more of the Tory right wing.
Sure.
And he's already presiding over a deeply fractured party, and that might just exacerbate those internal divisions.
You could always appoint another right winger to the Home Office to sort of appease them. I know that they'll still be annoyed that Braverman's gone, but the less sort of personality based right wingers in the Conservative Party might be appeased by that.
It is appalling just how dysfunctional that the entire party is. And
yeah, I know.
I do think it actually all comes down to this tension that I mentioned a second ago, I didn't really flesh out, which is this tension between the general public and even the sort of the Tory voting base and the Tory membership, which is just a lot more right-wing than even the Tory voting base. And when Suella Braverman is saying stuff like this, again, this one might be specifically popular, but her other policies and her other talking points and her like ridiculously harsh line on immigration, and I think she said stuff like diversity has failed or something.
She did, yeah.
All those sort of things, they play very well with with basically just the Tory membership and the very specific slice of the most right-wing bit of the British electorate. But they don't play well in the wider public. And there's Ipsos polling from this today, actually, which shows that Suella Braverman is the least popular of all Conservative frontbenchers that people recognise, for that matter. But the issue for the Tory party as a whole, or for the electability of the Tory party, is that while that might be true, and while she's clearly deeply, deeply unpopular with the wider public, this sort of stuff just does play well with the Tory membership. And that's clearly her intended audience.
Yeah.
And there's just no way of them resolving this tension. I mean, it does remind you of the Jeremy Corbyn years, when that tension became glaringly apparent within the Labour Party, that the membership was more left-wing than the voting base, or the required voting base, so they want to get a majority. And the Labour Party, they've sort of solved that conundrum, but it's a bit of a historical contingency that they did. I mean, they got sort of lucky that Starmer was there, and that he was a bit cheeky in that he basically said he was more left-wing than he really was, and then moved right. And whether or not the Tories have a similar figure in the sort of remnants of their parliamentary party that can drag them back to centre is a really open question. And I really do think the most likely outcome is they collapse. You've just written a script about Nigel Farage maybe taking over, but it'll be someone like Farage or Suella Braverman or someone on the right wing of the party that can appease the base. Yeah. And then where does the Tory party go? Is that it just pushes itself further into oblivion? I feel like Rishi Sunak was supposed to be their Keir Starmer, but he's failed, and so now they're just going to drift even further.
I think with all, I agree with absolutely all of that. And just as a side note on the Farage thing, I obviously a lot of the videos that we write sometimes speculative, and it's not necessarily. But that is one that I really do buy the argument that he could be the next Tory leader. Yeah. But that's a conversation for another time. I think just on the actual state of the party, governments that are in for a long time sometimes do burn out and run out of ideas, and factionalism sort of sets in. I know that we're going back a little bit here, but the post-war Attlee government had that. just very quickly, incredibly quickly. No, I know. It's still relevant. Anyway, by the end of that, factionalism set in, and they were out of office, and they spent the time out of office figuring out what they. Just bear with me.
Sorry.
You guys
go on. Tell us about the mid 1900s.
Yeah, it's fair. But this is the reason I bring it up is it's a pattern that repeats. It's not just relevant to them. Is that you have a government in charge? The factionalism sets in, and in their period of when they're out of office, they do soul searching. They figure out what the party stands for, and they come back together. And they managed to do that, and they managed to get back in office following that. And that's exactly where we're at now. The only difference now is that we're in this weird limbo period where they already know they're going to be out of office next year. They're just not yet. And it's so odd watching them be effectively an opposition party doing the soul searching, but while they're still in government. That's the unique part here. You have governments that burn out, lose elections, then do the soul searching. Yeah. The weird thing is that that's been brought forwards a year, and you're watching the government who's meant to be ruling basically using all of these opportunities that they should be using to run the country to effectively try and bring the party back together to stop electoral oblivion. And it seems that everything they do just makes things worse. Sunak tried not to put too much legislation in the King's Speech in an attempt to, appease everybody. So he put something too right-wing in there, it'll upset some people, so he tried to keep it light. And that's just upset people because there's nothing in there. He's not legislating. He's not being a prime minister. It's just it really is odd watching this slow motion car crash happen, and it's going to be weird that the next year. I don't see. Everything he does seems to be an attempt to fix the problem, and everything he does seems to make things worse.
I can't believe I'm going to actually refer back to your Attlee reference, but I do think it's interesting that when people are talking about the Tory experience right now...
How is he allowed to talk about Attlee?
Why is this you've broken the seal now.
Yeah, exactly. But people often refer back to... I mean, they don't normally go as far back as Attlee. They often refer back to... the classic is the post-Thatcher era the Tories, and the sort of like the soul searching that goes on then. But I think that there are when you think about it in those terms, there's a basic assumption that the Tory party is just going to survive in some form or another. It's going to do a Thatcher, it's going to do an Attlee. The two big parties have always been there, and they're just going to survive. But the polling is so bad for the Tories at the moment. I mean, I think the latest, maybe UCOV is saying that There are 23 points to Labour's 47.
Yeah.
Which is appalling. I mean, that's just literally half. That's half the Labour vote share. That's madness.
Yeah.
You know, if that actually manifests at a general election, and that might sound pessimistic from the Tory perspective. I mean, that might sound unrealistic. Tories will say that, oh, the polling will tighten up by the election. But at the moment, it's really not tightening up, and they look more dysfunctional than ever. So there's good reason to think it will maybe even widen. You know, if that actually manifests, then that is not a sort of Thatcher. It's not a 92 or 97 situation. It's not an Attlee situation, because you don't have the parliamentary base that both of those opposition governments ended up having. You know, if those results are translated to a general election, you end up with less than 100 MPs, and then you're basically the Lib Dems. I mean, you're irrelevant.
If those numbers are correct,
if those Nick Clegg out the park.
If those numbers are correct, I think it's even worse than 100. I think it's far fewer than 100.
I don't know what the maths is.
I think the maths is that it is a lot fewer. In fact, in some counts, if that polling is correct, I don't know if it's exactly that, but the Lib Dems become the second party, which is. I mean,
I still think that instinctively that's
obviously
that's
not.
But
the fact that even those, but the fact that those are even being just floated based on polling numbers is what that's never going to happen. But just the fact that that's being discussed is nuts.
But we've also, again, the reason I want to mention that is because I think that's a mistake by virtue of the fact that sort of take is just too UK centric. And if you look at the rest of Europe, you see that established parties die. Like they just do die. If you have one really bad election, voters are more volatile than they've ever been. You know, you can imagine a future where the Tory party lose catastrophically, and they go on to elect someone even more right wing, like a Suella Braverman sort of type, and they just sort of fade into oblivion. Their donors leave them. You know, they don't get, what's the name for the funding that opposition parties get? It's anything like that.
Oh, I don't know the name, but I know what you're on about. Sorry, I should know that.
And they just sort of like divided to oblivion.
France.
Them. Yeah, France. The socialists. Yeah. You know, whatever that result was in post, it's post, what's his name, Hollande.
Yeah.
They just became nothing.
Yeah.
And I think that's also true, but I think you see similar things in Germany at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, the SPD does look, I mean, maybe not that weak, but the German political system is really fracturing. There aren't like two big parties in the way that there used to be. And it's just sort of like naive and sort of like slightly inward looking, slightly myopic to assume that something similar couldn't happen here. And I think that risk is really underpriced. I keep saying this, every podcast we have, I say like, oh, look at the socialists of France, or look at like someone here, there and everywhere. And the Tory party could die. And I don't think that the Tory party is taking that seriously enough, that outcome seriously enough. I think that the fact that Suella Braverman is, you know, doing stuff like this, and that basically the whole load of backbench and frontbench MPs clearly vying for the future leadership. Yeah. It suggests that they don't think that the Tory party is going to be dead, because they think this, if they were leader of the Tory party, they could, you know, that's an important thing to be. Yeah. But it might not be anything. You know, Suella Braverman might be the leader, but just of a remnant of an established party.
There's also, I mean, I think this is also just a symptom of how broad a church they are, the fact that they have the moderates and the right-wingers, and they're constantly at play with each other. And if they do lose as badly as they do next time, Reform UK polling is actually not doing terribly, considering how new they are as a party. And I'm not saying that they're going to overtake the Tories or anything, and certainly not at the next election, but looking beyond that, they haven't got the same issue in the sense that them being a broad church. Sure. They're a very significant ideological faction. They could drive that split, and they don't have they don't have that divergence. Again, I'm not in any way suggesting they're going to overtake the Tories.
I think it's so interesting, because you're right about this. This is the thing that I think is weird about this moment, is that you're right, to broad church, especially within the parliamentary and what we might describe as the Conservative Party elite. And what the Conservative Party elite have been very good at doing over time is, especially since, I don't know when they introduced the reforms to membership, but especially since that leadership has been elected by the membership, they've been very good at pulling the Tory party back to electability. And that was always, in a sense, I guess, unsustainable, given that the membership ultimately decides. Yeah. You saw they did it with Sunak, and they got a lot of pushback there by basically rigging the election to make sure he went through. Yeah. And even then, that only really worked because such a massive fraction of Tory MPs were like, we can't do a Liz Truss. Yeah. But ultimately, because of the structure of Tory party leadership elections, it does come down to the membership. And while the parliamentary party is a broad church, the membership isn't. Yes. And so at the end of the day, they're fighting a tide that it's sort of inescapable. It's intractable. The tide is going to sweep them away, and the membership will eventually pull the Tory party to where it wants to be. I worry, by the way, that I think something similar could eventually happen to Labour. In that the same dynamics apply, and Keir Starmer looks like he's sort of saved Labour in that respect. But there is a sense in which that's only temporary, and that given that the Labour membership get the say at the end of the day, unless they change the structure of those elections, they will eventually pull them back. Have they changed the structure of those elections or not?
No, exactly. Not yet.
And so I think that's the risk that it's true for all political parties that try and bring or democratize their internal processes, because to democratize them, you have to widen your sort of like membership / voting base. And unfortunately, when you are a political party, you do just attract the most political people for those voting bases, and they might not be the most in tune with the wider electorate. Sorry, rant. But
No.
yeah.
No, I'm with you. I've just got a great video idea that I want to do tomorrow now. Anyway,
Oh, great. Okay, cool.
yeah.
Okay, I think
That's Suella Braverman.
That's
She's going to be
Suella.
leading a dying party.
Well, she
That's
might-
the conclusion,
she
right?
might be.
That's the
I keep on
conclusion.
saying
That's the
this.
TLDR.
I'm going like a pillock when the
Oh, they're going to win next time.
and Sunak hangs on, or Suella Braverman replaces him and wins a 200-seat majority.
Be Braverman then Farage.
Yeah?
That's it, yeah.
Who knows? Who knows?
Okay, so to round up, as always, let's look at the World Leader Leaderboard. I say that if you're listening, then you can't, but that's always a problem. On the leaderboard, we've got all of the politicians that we've put on historically over previous weeks. The top of the board are the people who are doing the best. The bottom of the board are the people who are doing the worst. Each week, each of us gets to move one person up and one person down a space. So let's start with the losers of the week. And Zach, let's start with your loser of the week. Who are you moving down on the board?
I am moving down, or I should say to the mic, I am moving down Joe Biden.
Oh,
Yeah.
he was formerly at the very top of the board, wasn't he?
He was doing very well, and I think, unfortunately, this betrays... Sorry, this is not going to the mic.
I'll move it.
I think, unfortunately, this betrays a sort of transatlantic divide in perceptions, in that from the UK or Europe, Biden looks like he's having a great time. You know, he's got a functioning industrial policy. He's successfully deterred Iran from getting into the war. You know, his strong support for Ukraine has damaged Russia, although that's sort of changing now.
Yeah.
But he is not popular in America.
Yeah.
And polling by New York Times with Siena, I think, found that not only Biden is now a couple of points behind Trump nationally, but he is also losing by 5/6 points in all of the key swing states,
Yeah.
or like a handful of key swing
Yeah.
states. And well, that's just not good for the Democrats, and it makes the possibility of a Trump return, it becomes a real possibility.
Yeah.
I mean, he now looks dangerously electable.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a prejudiced thing to say. I just think anyone who wants like relative stability in a time of such sort of precarious foreign policy, or sort of like, you know, global politics, geopolitics, yeah, you probably don't want Donald Trump in there. But yeah, anyway, that is the person I'm moving down.
Ben, who are you moving down?
I'm moving Sunak down,
Ooh,
broadly for
where
two
is he?
reasons. Number one is just basically what we've spent the last half an hour discussing, but also just his King's speech was relatively badly received.
Yeah.
It was the longest speech since 2005 and had the least legislation in since 2014. So
Can I move
pretty
the
bad.
king down too for having to deliver the speech?
It's up to you. I mean,
I'm moving the king
you run
down.
it, don't you?
Yeah, there he comes.
Oh,
There's not much room.
it's kind of
Pop him in
brutal
there.
that we're moving him down. He's not done anything.
I think
He's
looked
delivered a
pretty-
bad speech.
I think he looked pretty sad delivering the speech.
Yeah.
I think you could see on his face he knew it was nonsense.
Yeah, he didn't like some of the environmental stuff. You could tell.
No.
He looked quite unhappy during those bits.
I really like the king at the moment.
Oh well, you can put him up next week. Speaking of going up, who is your winner of the week? Who's going up, Zach?
Mine is Keir Starmer.
Ooh, okay, we cleared a space for Charles.
Yeah.
There we go. Why is Keir going up?
I'm putting Keir Starmer up because I think in the sort of week or two preceding, this podcast, but the last sort of like, let's say month since the Hamas attacks, really, the sort of consensus in the, I was going to say the Westminster bubble, but that's such a fucking like right-wing talking point. I don't
Sure.
mean like that. But the consensus in the Westminster bubble has been that Starmer's having a tough time because his positioning on Gaza has sort of, it's been difficult because he's trying to simultaneously demonstrate that he's not Jeremy Corbyn and that he takes anti-Semitism seriously, but also keep Muslim voters on side or Arab voters on side. And there's some very sort of tentative polling, which should all be taken with a pinch of salt, suggesting that Muslim and Arab voters are ditching the Labour Party. But recent national polling just doesn't bear that out. And I think part of this is a symptom of the fact that, sure, they might be ditching the Labour Party, but where are they going to go? You know? Like I saw some of the Navarra media people saying pointing out some front benchers and being like, oh, they've only got this larger majority. Let's get them out of office. And I was like, well, you get them out of office, you're just going to get a Tory in there instead, you know. So I think he's doing pretty well because the national polling suggests that actually his lead has increased recently.
Okay.
So that's just my one. I mean, he's survived what looks like a turbulent time for him. There's some internal disunity, but the headline polling is still pretty good.
Yeah.
And I think that's good for Starmer.
Ben, who's your loser of the week? Winner of the week, sorry.
Winner of the week is Anthony Albanese. He's going up. He had a meeting in China this week to try and reset diplomatic relations.
Yeah.
And that seems to have gone well. In the speeches he gave about it, he seemed to sort of address some of the concerns about closer relationship he's pursuing with China and some of the issues with, the problematic elements of doing that.
The close relationship is...
No, China.
Oh, okay.
China. Okay. And they've also agreed a new visa scheme and all this to try and demonstrate that they are a lot closer. So yeah, I think it's gone pretty well.
He's having a good time.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
that's actually a very interesting story, I think, yeah.
Underreported.
Well, look, I was thinking that, and I was thinking that my underreported could have been the fact that the US is saying that they've confirmed a meeting between Xi and Biden at the sidelines of the Asia Pacific
She's doing
Economic
pretty well by the
Summit.
sounds of it too then. He's meeting with everyone.
Yeah, she is. Well, it depends what you mean by doing well, but yeah, he's definitely
He's doing
loosening.
stuff.
He's doing stuff.
He's doing
That's
stuff.
undeniably true. Leader of the biggest country in the world is doing
stuff.
Yeah, bare minimum, I'd say. But yeah, no, he's doing stuff.
Okay, good. Great. Insightful analysis from all of us today. That's all we have time for in today's episode of the TLDR News Podcast. We'll be back again next week, maybe with Rory. Anyone off next
Hopefully
week?
with Rory.
Are we all here next week?
It depends if I get Rory's cold.
Oh yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
Well,
that's true.
Fingers crossed. We'll all be here next week for a big return, and we'll see you then.